We appreciate you taking time out of your schedule to join us for this period of Bible study. How many of you want to follow Jesus? I'm sure many of you think you are following Jesus. Many more would probably say, well, I would like to follow Jesus. But are we really willing to do what the Bible talks about when it says that we should follow Jesus? For example, in 1 Peter chapter 2 and verse 21, he said, but to this you were called, because Christ also suffered for us, leaving us an example that we should follow his steps. There's two main ideas in this verse. One is, of course, that Christ has left us an example. An example means like the headline of a copybook that we are to imitate, such as when you're learning to write and when you're a very little child. You have the letters of the alphabet at the very top of the page, and then you as a child is supposed to imitate those just as closely as you possibly can. Or maybe like the blueprint of a building. We have to follow that blueprint exactly. Well, that's the idea. Christ has left us an example. That is something we should follow just as close as we possibly can. And then the idea of follow. We should follow his steps, like the footprints of a leader upon which we are to plant our very own. You know, we are to follow his footsteps. Now that sounds kind of exciting in a way, doesn't it? If Christ is really our king, and then following our king sounds exciting. As we work on this earth, we find that we're doing the same thing Christ did because he worked as a trade as well. As we studied the scripture, we find that, well, Jesus did that too. But as we continue to read and think about this, then the excitement of following Jesus leaves us. Because we realize that following Jesus is not just an adventure, but following Jesus can be very hard work. Because we read in 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 23 and 24, just a couple of verses later, we find these words, who when he was reviled, did not revile in return. When he suffered, he did not threaten, but committed himself to him who judges righteously, who himself bore our sins in his own body on the tree, that we, having died to sins, might live for righteousness, by whose stripes you were healed. You see, in these verses, we find that following Jesus involved the idea of suffering. Jesus suffered upon his life. That's why he came to earth, so that he could die. That is, so he could suffer. And our very existence as Christians also then involves the idea of suffering. You see, the calling of Jesus is a calling to suffer. John 16, verse 33, Jesus said, these things I have spoken to you, that in me you may have peace. In the world you will have tribulation, but be of good cheer. I have overcome the world. Here Christ said, while you're living on the earth, you're going to have tribulation. Paul wrote in 1 Thessalonians 3 and verse 4, for in fact, we told you before when we were with you that we would suffer tribulation, just as it happened and you know. In other words, Paul reminding these Christians in Thessalonica, I told you I was going to have tribulation, and you know that it happened just as I said. Are we really willing to follow Jesus wherever he leads? Now, many say they are. We have some varied examples in the Bible, even of people who very boldly said, I will follow you no matter where you go. For example, in Matthew chapter 8, in verses 19 and 20, look at these verses for just a moment as we see what this person boldly claimed to be willing to do. In verse 19, we find that a certain scribe came and said to him, Teacher, I will follow you wherever you go. Now that sounds like a very good offer, doesn't it? Here's a man who is very dedicated to Jesus. Even a scribe, most scribes were enemies of Jesus. But this scribe said, I will follow you wherever you go. But then he reminded him in the very next verse, foxes have holes and birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. You see, Christ wanted to remind this scribe that following Jesus was not what he thought it was going to be. What was he thinking? Well, we don't know for sure, but this is what I think. You see, this was at a time when multitudes were now following Jesus. Jesus was healing many who were sick. It was a very exciting time, and I imagine this scribe was envisioning a glorious journey filled with all kinds of excitement, amazing events and miracles, and multitudes following Jesus. Oh, it was going to be a marvelous journey. But Jesus quickly ended that idea. It was not going to be what he thought it was going to be. You see, these words about following Jesus can be easily spoken, but oftentimes hard to follow. Then we looked at John 11, and we find some of the same ideas found there. John 11 in verse 16, but Thomas, who was called the twin, said to his fellow disciples, let us also go, that we may die with him. Here Thomas is very boldly saying, I will follow Jesus no matter where it goes, even if it means dying. I will die for Jesus. And then we look at chapter 13, verse 37 of the same book. Here we come to Peter, and Peter saying the same words. Lord, why can I not follow you now? I will lay down my life for your sake. Undoubtedly, both Thomas and Peter were very sincere when they made this promise that they would be willing to die for Jesus. But later we see, of course, they were not that strong. This should be an eternal warning to all self-confident people about how faithful they are and how strong they are in their spiritual journey. You see, Peter and Thomas did not really understand that what following Jesus meant. And that's why they could not follow Jesus right now. Many say today they're willing to follow Jesus. Many will say, God spoke to me and told me to do this, or God led me to this place. But almost always it is something that is good for them or good for their career. Rarely does this place that God led them to involve suffering. And yet in the cases we just looked at, when people boldly said they will follow Jesus, Jesus pointed out that following him involved suffering and hardship. I dare say most of us would boldly say the same thing. I will follow him wherever he leads until hardship comes. And then our faith is tested. You see, we do not want much hardship either. So what does it mean to follow Jesus? And what do we get if we do follow Jesus? Going back to John chapter 12 and verse 26. Notice here what John wrote. In verse 26 he said, if anyone serves me, let him follow me. And where I am, there my servant will be also. If anyone serves me, him my Father will honor. Jesus here is saying that we must be willing to serve Jesus. Now that's basically another term for following Jesus. And as we said before, many people would say, oh, I'm willing to follow you. But the word serve here simply means to be a servant. To serve Jesus means to follow him, to imitate him, particularly in regards to his suffering. Because immediately after making this statement, Jesus predicts his death. But then Jesus said, if we are really willing to follow him, to serve him, then God will honor us. But before God will honor us, we must be willing to be a living sacrifice. Romans chapter 12 and verse 1. You see, to be Christ's disciples means that we must be completely and totally committed to him and his cause. That means we're willing to do whatever needs to be done. Yes, it may mean sometimes you're doing nothing more than help others do the work. We sometimes sing the song, I'm ready to suffer. But too often Christians want to do their own thing without much regard for the work of others. You see, to really follow Jesus means we work for the growth of the kingdom, not for the growth of my kingdom, but the growth of Jesus' kingdom. And that might involve suffering. Now, why should we follow Jesus? Well, as we've said before in John 12:26, we should follow Jesus because by following Jesus, God will honor us. We become sons of God and joint heirs with Christ. Paul wrote in Romans 8, verses 16 and 17, the Father bears witness with our spirit that we are the children of God. And if children, then heirs, heirs of God and joint heirs with Christ. But then notice, if indeed we suffer with him, that we also may be glorified together. You see, we love to think about the idea of being joint heirs with Christ. We love to think about the idea of being glorified and sitting with Jesus on the great throne in the hereafter. But before we can do that, Jesus said we must be willing to suffer with him. Paul wrote in 2 Timothy chapter 4, verses 6 through 8. He said, for I am already being poured out as a drink offering, and the time of my departure is at hand. I have fought the good fight, I have finished the race, I have kept the faith. Finally, there is laid up for me a crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will give me at that day. Not to me only, but unto all them who have loved his appearing. Here again, we find that this is at the end of Paul's life, and he is recounting what he had suffered, how that he had been poured out as a drink offering. Yes, he suffered a great deal in his life, didn't he? But he knew that his race was over. And he said, I have fought the good fight and finished the race. And now he's encouraging us to follow him in this race. And he reminds us that if we do follow him and we do finish the course, then there's a crown of righteousness laid up for us. Now again, we love to think about this crown. We love to think that one day we're going to have that crown of righteousness placed upon us. And we're going to hear the words of God, well done, good and faithful servant. But before that can happen, we must be willing to suffer. We must be willing to lay down our lives, as Paul did, be poured out as a drink offering. No, we may not have to suffer as much as Paul does, and hopefully we will not have to suffer that much. But the principle is still the same. No matter how much we will have to suffer, we must be willing to do that. That's what is involved in following Jesus. We must be willing to suffer. You see, following Jesus is not a life of roses. It's not a bed of ease in which you can just kind of float along, enjoying your relationship with Jesus. That's the way many people look at it. Indeed, many people look at following Jesus as a life of ease. And if you're really following Jesus, God is going to bless you with money and ease and power and popularity. Oh, life is going to be great. But more often than not, we find that Jesus and his apostles reminding us that following Jesus is not that way. Following Jesus involves suffering. And that's what we must be willing to do today. I encourage you to think about this. And while we should all be willing to follow Jesus, don't be deceived into thinking that following Jesus is going to solve all your problems. Indeed, it may well lead to suffering. But if we're willing to endure that suffering and follow Jesus and finish the course, indeed, there's a crown of righteousness laid up for us at the end. And we find a great honor that God will give to all of his children. Thank you.